All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 7. I'm not sure at what point you're actually watching this video since they go up early, but week 7 does take us out of the month of September. I hope everything is going well for you and that your assignments are staying on track. By now, and before you take the quiz, you should have finished Civil War. If you are trying to get through this unit by watching the movie, instead of reading the comic, you're not going to do well on either the quiz or the writing assignment that's due this week, because they have very little to do with each other outside of the fact that Cap and Iron Man punch each other a couple of times. So make sure that you've read the comic. I know for sure this one is available on the Marvel comic service. You don't have to buy it. Um, I forget now what it's called. Or you don't have to buy the physical copy. A digital copy works just fine. Here's our icebreaker for this week. Which superhero and or villain that has not been in a modern live action movie since '08, which is the start of the MCU, would you be most excited to see in a film? This can be, remember, can be anime or manga characters. Doesn't have to, it could be foreign language graphic novel characters. Doesn't have to be from the two big publishers here in the US. So pause right now, go over to Canvas, post in the icebreaker forum. And if you're doing these ahead of time, like if you're working ahead in the class, which is totally fine, just do try to remember to come back to each week and post the icebreakers so you're interacting with your classmates on Canvas. It'll help create some community for when we start, for when I create breakout groups to edit each other's papers, which that will come towards the end of semester. When I do my writing do's and don'ts video, that's when I will cover the breakout groups, and that's also when I will assign them that week. So, um, stay tuned. It'll be a couple of weeks out from this video, but you'll know well before your papers are due for editing, who your classmates are and how to get in contact with them. Um, so yeah, go ahead and pause, go over and answer this. I'm excited to see your answers. I think for me, Um, the character I would be most excited to see in a live action movie is Tim Drake's Robin. I know he was in Titans. Um, Tim or Damian should be the Robin we should have gotten with Batfleck, and we didn't. And it looks like we're again resetting the continuity to go back to a younger Batman with the Matt Reeves movies, which the Batman with Pattinson with Patton Bat um, is probably my favorite on-screen Batman, and so I would be really interested to see what he does with a Robin. Um, but I do think that for the purposes of having like a really good, teenager Robin, you do need a Batman who's a little older. I think if you remember Batman Forever, which came out probably before most of you were born, um, the Val Kilmer movie, Christopher, oh goodness, not Christopher Nolan. Now I'm blanking. Chris O'Donnell. Chris O'Donnell was Robin, and he was a little old. And then we haven't really seen a live action big screen Robin since. But yeah, it would be kind of cool to see a big screen Robin, um, and done well. Maybe James Gunn is the guy to bring that to the screen, and maybe he's not. So, all right, this week we're going to dive into legacy characters and talk about a shift from last week into how people of color, and we're going to expand a little beyond people of color because you can't really talk about this next topic without talking about other minority identities or at least marginalized identities, even if they're not in the minority. So, um, because women are not a minority identity, there's actually more women on the planet than men, but it is a marginalized identity. So there's that. Um, Talking about legacy care. Last week's lecture brought us through kind of the history of the three major minority groups as people of color. You'll notice that I didn't spend time talking about whiteness, capital W whiteness, and I'm gonna have to here. to kind of give a um, standard by which legacy characters are applied. So let's talk about whiteness. Whiteness hasn't always just been about skin tone. Um, there is a core to whiteness that is tied inexorably to upper crust aristocracy, first class versus second class citizen mentality. Now, I say mentality instead of reality because there are an awful lot of white folks who are working rural poor who still consider themselves capital W white, and still act like they have well, even if they don't recognize it, they still act in a from a place of privilege. Um, some of my relatives in the South are dirt poor, and dirt poor, by the way, to my knowledge, comes from that saying comes from the idea that you couldn't afford a floor in your house, that your floors were dirt, and that's how poor you were, is that you slept on dirt. And some of my relatives, especially in Georgia and Arkansas, were dirt poor, even if they're not anymore. Um, but I still have, very impoverished family members that live in the American South. And what's unique about poor white folks versus other folks who aren't living above the poverty line is that um, poor white folks consistently vote and act in their own worst interests. Um, there are a lot of politicians and a lot of programs that could really help the working class poor, and yet it's those working class poor that seemed hell-bent on conserving their status as poor people, when they could really be getting the help they need. So whiteness then is tied to a place of privilege and also a almost entitlement. You'll notice that a lot of working class poor people think that they're one big break away from being wealthy. And one of the things that keeps poor white voters poor is that they're concerned about the day where they're going to be rich white voters. And every study shows that, like, obviously that's not going to be a thing. The number of billionaires and millionaires out there is very small compared to the number of people. Um, in fact, I know there's less than 100 billionaires. And oh, that's not what I meant to do. Hold on. Get that out of there. You can tell I've been watching YouTube edutainment. Okay. So we're still here. Okay. Let me see if I can get you an exact number on how many millionaires there are. How many millionaires in the United States? Um, so US has an adult population of 250 million people, about. This is from July of this year, of 2024, I should say, because I'm not going to re-record these lectures for spring. So July of 2024, um, and there are about 24 million, according to this, millionaires. Hold on. Yeah. So about 8% of the US population is rich. It has over $1 million in their bank account. A shocking number of those 20 million people have roughly between 1 and 5 million. So like, and a million ain't what it used to be, if we're being honest. So um, that leads to the idea that every every poor white voter is concerned about the day they're going to be one of those rich white voters, and they're just not going to do that, right? Like one in every eight, well, less than one in every 10 people, one, 8 in every 100. is either a millionaire or a billionaire, and that's a bigger number probably than it even should be. Um, and there really shouldn't be billionaires, but that's a lot of people who are hoping to be in that club someday that just aren't going to make it in their lifetime and fail to recognize that the people who are making it there are doing it fundamentally at the expense of the people who aren't going to make it. So, when 92% of the population isn't there, and I'm wondering what percentage of I'm going to guess. Well, this source, which is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, also says that 43.4% of the world's wealth, so just under half, is controlled by the top 1%, not even those 8%. So what we're looking at is a world where uh, the kind of attitudes around whiteness, even though it's not a culture, if you will, still come from like an old aristocracy or an old set of ideas where um, the folks who are keeping these systems in place, these rural white voters who are keeping these systems in place, are the ones who are often most harmed by it. So that's what we've got with the conception of whiteness. Yes, it is tied to skin color, but it's not the only thing. Historically speaking, and again, I'm a historian, just to remind you, historically speaking, skin tone wasn't the only thing that counted for whiteness, and there are folks with light or white skin tones who often weren't included in those whiteness. The kind of two big American examples would have been Italian and Irish immigrants. They were treated as second and third class citizens when they tried to immigrate. It's not real slavery, but there's the whole myth around Irish slavery, around building the railroads. Um, and the idea then is that um, the concept of whiteness is fluid to who we're willing to let into the group. Um, Ian Danskin, who is the creator of Innuendo Studios, and he has a YouTube series called the Alt-Right Playbook. I super recommend you take a look at that if you're interested in the political machinations and the kind of psychology behind the alt-right. Um, he says in that it's whiteness is an expandable tent that you can add more people to stay in the majority. But once you've put those minorities back in their place, that tent then is comfortable shrinking, and it's last in, first out. And so one of the big interesting kind of developments over the last 10 years is the right's adoption of openly gay people to their cause, even though prior to 10 years ago, and even still, it's those right wing, extreme right wing folks who would rather those gay people not exist. And so, when the alt-right has kind of used, if they win, which they won't, I hope they won't. But if the alt-right gets what they want, then they will then turn on the next villain up, which would, be white gays. And so we can see this as a repeated historical pattern. And so when we set up the concept of whiteness and we apply it, so that's kind of real world setup, right? And we apply it to a comic book, what we're looking at is a series of characters who were, um, as I said last week, straight, white, uh, cisgendered men. And we're going to look at a change in the way that not just people of color, but also other minority identities were introduced in graphic novels, which really starts in the 70s. The very first one's in 1970, but after that is a slow shift, which really picks up um, momentum in the late 80s, early 90s. So we're going to start not necessarily now by talking about the um, concept of, sorry, we're not going to take this concept chronologically. We're going to take it thematically and kind of by importance. And then I'm just going to go through some examples. So if you'll remember back to last week's lecture, and even before that, I mentioned that John Stewart's Green Lantern is the first legacy character. He replaces not one, but two former white guys. when he takes over, and Jon Stewart's character has been a really popular iteration. That is the iteration that they used in the Justice League cartoon. That's the iteration that they've kind of gone with on and off for most of the adult animation. And based on all of the um, rumors and kind of casting leaks, it looks like he's going to feature in the upcoming Lantern series, which is supposed to be on HBO Max. So John's a very popular character, but he's not the most popular legacy character. One of the things that is interesting about Marvel Comics and Spider-Man in particular is that they have a problem letting Peter Parker grow up. And um, after you've just finished reading Civil War, or you will finish reading this week, Peter does something in that, and I don't want to spoil it, but at least he makes a really bad decision in Civil War, and puts his family at risk. And as a result, um, this leaves him exposed and his family exposed, and leads to some really tragic and traumatic things happening to Peter, and then it leads to one of the worst graphic novels ever written called Brand New Day. It's either One More Day or Brand New Day. Brand New Day. Spider-Man Brand New Day. And that is terrible. It's a terrible comic book, but functionally it resets Spider-Man inside of the Marvel continuity. He goes back to being young. He goes back to being unmarried. People forget him. And Marvel has this weird um, focus on not letting Peter grow up. Well, they knew after they did this once that they couldn't get away with doing it again. And so what they were really looking forward was to reset Spider-Man back to high school because that's when he was the most popular. And knowing that they couldn't get away with resetting Peter's age again, the only other choice was to introduce a new Spider-Man. And so they did. And they took Spider-Man, Peter Parker, here on your left, and they introduced Miles Morales here on your right. Now, I need to pause and impress upon you how big of a deal introducing Miles as a new Spider-Man was. And they did it through the Ultimates universe, so if it didn't pay off, actually, I should explain the Ultimates universe, assuming that not all of you are as into comics as I am. The Ultimates universe was a Elseworld, so not canon, kind of an experimental world where authors and artists got a chance to like crank everyone to the extreme and try to introduce some new characters, and maybe they would pay off and maybe they wouldn't. And that's where we got Miles from, was from this Ultimates universe. He has made his way into canon, so Miles isn't stranded out there. Um, but what what was so significant about Miles is how big of a risk he was initially. Spider-Man by himself, cut him out of Marvel. Spider-Man by himself is a billion with a B dollar property. That's a lot of money wrapped up in one character, and he is far and away Marvel's most popular character. In comics, in video games, in toys, in movies, he is far and away Marvel's most popular character. Bar none, no one's even close. You can make an argument for Wolverine, you can make an argument, you can't really make an argument for Deadpool. Um, Spider-Man is the most popular character. Um, and changing something that was fundamental about Peter, taking him from a kind of working class white kid who's an orphan and replacing him with someone who's none of those things, right? Miles is middle class. He's mixed race. His mom's Latina and his dad's black. He's the only thing that's similar is they're both in New York. This was a huge risk. To use a sports metaphor, and I'm sorry for those of you that aren't sports fans, but this would have been like the Patriots at the height of their run replacing Tom Brady with Kevin Hart. Kevin Hart is nothing like Tom Brady, not physically, not intellectually, not personality wise. They don't come from the same cities. They're nothing alike. And so this was a huge risk, and it paid off. And it paid off in a massive way. Massive way. Um, we talked. when I mentioned before about Black Panther, uh, that Black Panther brought black folks to uh, movies, and not just superhero movies, but movies in a way they normally do not attend movies, especially older black people. Brought black folks out to the movies, tapped in whole and tapped market. Miles did the same thing with young black men and women, uh, and gave kind of the first mainstream, not the only, I don't want to say only, but the first really popular mainstream mixed race person. Um, as like a beacon for kids, and did it in such a way that wasn't a stereotype. You know, Miles isn't a thug, he's not rude, he's not mean. So in 2011, when he came out, also you got to remember, Peter had been one of, if not the only, there were Spider-Man Miguel O'Hara, Spider-Man 2099 had existed before this, but there'd not been a continuity changing Spider-Man ever since 1963, and this is 2011. And so, huge risk from Marvel's point, and obviously popular two major animated movies, a blockbuster video game or two, like he's appeared in all of the Insomniac games for the PlayStation. Um, Miles is a character, a playable character in tabletop games like Crisis Protocol. Miles is insanely popular and fundamentally changed the way Spider-Man is approached and the way Marvel approached young heroes, as well as um, the idea that heroes can grow up and other people can come along and take the mantle. Yeah, it was a big change for Marvel. Um, that wasn't Marvel's only big change as a result of Civil War. Um, you'll recognize Falcon and Captain America here on screen. Captain America on the left, Steve Rogers, obviously Falcon on the right. If you're caught up with the MCU and you've seen Falcon and the Winter Soldier, or the preview for, because at this point it's just a preview, like Thunderbolts hasn't come out yet, and Captain America New World Order hasn't come out yet. But if you're caught up on those things, then you're aware that Anthony B. Mackie's Falcon does take over for Chris Evans's Cap in the MCU, and that's something that happened from the comics. Um, that is a byproduct also of the Civil War comic you read. At the end of that, Captain America is ostensibly killed, assassinated, and Falcon blends the two costumes like he does in the show and picks up the mantle. This was also a political statement from Marvel. Marvel intentionally, remember I mentioned that comics have always been political and that oftentimes it's intentional. That is what's happening here. Um, if you look at kind of how Cap is dressed and the fact that, a black man took over, not just a black man, but a black veteran took over, it was important for Captain America to remain a veteran, right? Keeping the captain rank was important for veteran representation. We're going to talk about veteran representation and the veteran experience late in the semester. Um, but uh, having that rank still associated, even though it's Air Force versus Army, was really important. But Marvel was making a point that Captain America could be anyone, could look like anyone. It wasn't necessarily Captain America isn't necessarily white. Um, and that's the argument. Like Marvel did this on purpose. It was a political statement. Um, and I'm pretty sure this was done during the Obama administration, which makes sense because DC also did a run where on an alternate world where Superman is a black man and is also president. They basically made Super Obama. Um, Cap Falcon first appearance. Do-do-do-do-do-do. Not seeing a date, but I'm certain it was during the Obama administration. So, um, this this was eventually redone, and also in Bucky, Winter Soldier served a stint as Captain America as well. I believe Steve is currently back as Captain America, and Sam is back as back in his Falcon um, costume. So Falcon ends up being one of the first black characters, and also then one of the first legacy characters when he takes on the role of Captain America. This is something I want you to consider when we're talking about these legacy characters and the way these folks are portrayed. I have a I think this is great. I love the political statement that Marvel was making. I do sometimes wonder if Falcon as a character then is kind of less cool, or lessened by the fact that a black man is willing to put down that mantle to pick up a different mantle, which is seen as more important. And Cap's been an A-lister, and Falcon always isn't always an A-lister. So maybe that argument is just purely like a publishing and popularity argument. Also, there is a second Falcon that steps up, who's a Latin American man. So there's a version of legacy charactering going on there as well. But yeah. We've talked already about Cassandra Cain taking over the role of Batgirl. Now, you'll notice that this is an instance of legacy characterization where, rather than coming from a white man, it comes from a white woman. Um, in this instance, it's less about kind of ticking all of the privilege boxes and more about expanding representation through an existing character. Barbara had been in the wheelchair for a long time before they introduced a new Batgirl. And sometimes it's just about, hey, we want to publish a new Batgirl, but we don't want to undo really powerful storytelling. And so they come up with a character. But either way, Cassie comes in this time period, this really volatile, like late 90s, early 2000s time period, where they're really trying to aggressively expand representation because by then, comic companies have learned that if you want to survive, you have to have a diverse readership base, and that means making sure that everybody can see themselves in at least one hero. And I've talked about Cassie kind of in depth, so I'm not gonna spend a ton of time here on her since we talked about her earlier in the semester. I just wanted to point her out as a character. Oh, okay. Here we go. Sorry for the bouncing. This is probably one a lot of you don't realize is a legacy character. Especially if you come to my class mostly experiencing these movies through the MCU and not so much through the graphic novels. Here on the left is um, Ms. Marvel, and you'll notice that she is Ms. Marvel um, in Civil War. She is present in that costume on the left in Civil War. That is Carol Danvers. That is Brie Larson's character from the comics. In the comics, Ms. Marvel is a mutant, and she is ambushed by Rogue. That is where Rogue gets her flight and super strength, and placed into a coma. After she awakes from the coma, she is then captured, rescued. It's kind of ambiguous by the Kree, an alien race. And just like the movie Captain Marvel, she's given her powers, and it comes from one of the Infinity Gems. At least in the movie, in the comics, it comes from the Kree Supreme Intelligence. Um, Here, pictured on the left, and also she's based in New Jersey. Pictured on the right is Kamala Khan. That is the current Ms. Marvel, and the one the MCU TV show is about. And Kamala also appears in the Marvels. Her lore is hilarious. Oh, and also Kamala is the central figure to the Avengers video game that had the live service Avengers video game from a few years ago that had mixed reviews, but I thought was pretty fun. Um, Live service games aren't always the way to go for a game like that, but some, had a decent player base at least initially. Um, Kamala is a fangirl and has the ultimate fangirl experience. She is a huge Ms. Marvel fan, having both of them being headquarters in New Jersey. Kamala is also the daughter of Pakistani immigrants. And so Kamala's first volume of her story, if you're looking to do your paper on like the immigrant story or immigration in any way, I highly recommend Ms. Marvel Volume 1, No Normal. That is a great resource for that paper. And also, it's just a great read. If you're a comic reader and you've never read that, that should be a place you should go. There's tons of casual racism, like we talked about last week. kind of the idea of what makes a white person, and also does a great job of distinguishing between different religious traditions and different cultural traditions among Middle Eastern immigrants. Phenomenal book. But Kamala uh, is a fangirl and then gets hit by the Terrigen Mist, which is the same thing that makes the Inhumans, and gives her superpowers. And so she does, just like in the just like in the series. If you haven't seen it, it's on Disney Plus. I'd recommend watching it. It's very cute. Is a big fan of Captain Marvel, so kind of makes herself over in Ms. Marvel's image. Um, yeah, it's great. And Kamal is widely considered to be one of the best, if not the best, um, characters for representation for Middle Eastern women. This is the Atom. Uh, on the left, it's Ray Palmer. If you've seen Legends of Tomorrow or any of the Arrowverse shows, this is Brandon Routh's character. Um, and on the right is Ryan Choi. Now, here is an interesting example of how comic publishing works. Comic storylines are often written and ready to go at least a year in advance before they come out. And you're usually making decisions about your character's futures 2 years in advance. Any living constant publishing thing is also this way. If you play Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh or Pokemon, those are all done the same way. Set development is 2 years out from when they come out. So, whatever set just came out now, they're working on what they finished that 2 years ago. Or they were, wrapping it up through the post-production process, and the designers have already moved well beyond. Same's true for movies, right? You start working on them 2 years before they come out. TV series, like you're oftentimes doing these things in the future. And as a result, you sometimes make decisions on imperfect information, or you make a decision on 2-year-old information and it turns out to not work out for the present. So Ryan Choi was not popular at first. And so they're like, oh, we don't, this character's not really hitting. People kind of don't like him. So they made the decision to kill him. They have Deathstroke kill him. Uh, but by the time they got to those issues, he had become really popular, and this was kind of the drawback of making your decisions on, older imperfect information. They just weren't ready for Ryan, and he actually ended up being thrown away as a character, and it's really unfortunate. He has poked his head up in a couple that into some live action stuff. He does appear on screen and has a speaking role in the Snyder Cut version of. Um, the Justice League. He is at Star Labs with Silas Stone, with Cyborg's dad, so you can see him in live action. Um, even though, yeah, even though he's dead in the comics. Uh, this is Blue Beetle. Ted Cord on the left and Jaime Reyes on the right. Uh, I love Jaime. The Blue Beetle movie that came out a couple years ago did not deserve to get released in the midst of the transition away from the DCEU and into James Gunn's universe. I really hope this is a character James Gunn goes forward with, because I think it's someone that James has a particular knack for bringing forward, and I think it would really work in a DCU. He's great in the comics. He's wonderful in like Young Justice and kind of the other cartoons. He's great in Injustice, the video game. He's super fun to play. But Jaime has one of the funniest moments, one of the most human and funniest moments. Jaime is also a young Latino man who does not conform to stereotypes. In fact, he's doing everything he can to stay out of gangs, and so you can kind of see that we've come a long way. Um, Go back 20 years to the beginning of the, you know, Fast and the Furious films, and if you had a Latino character, they looked and dressed and sounded a certain way, men and women, and we've come a long way. And Jaime's one of those examples. But Jaime's my favorite um, thing about Jaime is they focus less on his race and more about his age. He's a wonderful coming of age story. And yes, they do use that to highlight his Latino, the way, young Latino men interact with coming to age, and some of that's very poignant. But my favorite instance with Jaime is it could have happened to anybody. And he's serving soup on like Thanksgiving with a pretty girl. And Jaime's suit is actually a symbiotic alien, not entirely unlike Venom, but not quite the same, that is attached to him and, gives him this exoskeleton. It looks like a beetle. Ted Kord had that beetle beforehand, but never could bond with it. He just used it to reverse engineer all of his inventions. You can see he's got a beetle ship way up there. That was all made from studying the scarab. Um, it bonds with Jaime and gives him all these extra powers. And Jaime's blood pressure, sees pretty girl, his blood pressure and heart rate go up, as you might if you're flustered around somebody who's really attractive. And the suit reads that as a threat and keeps trying to kill this poor girl while they're just trying to help the homeless. And so Jaime ends up running into a closet and is like trying to talk to the beetle. But Jaime hasn't quite figured out talking in his head yet, so he's talking out loud, and he has his back turned to the door when the young lady comes in to try to check on him, and it really just looks like Jaime's bent over talking to his junk, trying to get his junk to settle down. It is one of the most hilarious awkward teen moments I've ever read, and just so wholesome and also just being exasperating. It's been a long time since I've been a teenager, but I remember that it was exasperating a lot of the time. Here's a character you may not be super familiar with. This is Mr. Terrific. There on the left, Mr. Terrific's one of those original 1940s era characters. In that version of it, he's a pro wrestler who then also goes out and faces crime. Mr. Terrific 2 on the right is Michael Collins, who also, news alert, former Olympian, but is also in comics called the world's third smartest man. DC never says who the other two are, but it's widely considered that they're Bruce Wayne and Lex Luthor. Possibly Lucius Fox is up there. Lex is usually regarded as the smartest human on the planet, um, hence why he's evil. Michael is grew up a fan of the original Mr. Terrific's pro wrestling, and so he adopts that character when he takes over. Also, Mr. Terrific is a college professor, so college professor and pro wrestling fan also describes me. I have a special place in my heart for Mr. Terrific. I am not an Olympian. I hate to break it to you. I'm a good fencer, but I'm not Olympian quality. I mentioned Carol Danvers earlier, relicensed character as Captain Marvel. Turns out she is also then a legacy character when she inherits the Captain Marvel mantle there on the left. There behind her is the original Captain Marvel for Marvel Comics, not Shazam. Remember, he was the original Captain Marvel, but as far as Marvel's publishing goes, that's him. Marvel. And Marvel dies a couple of times and hands off his role as Captain Marvel to Carol Danvers, who's featured there front and center. That's same character as was Ms. Marvel a couple of frames ago. And then there on the right is Monica Rambeau, who we've been introduced to through WandaVision and some of the other and the Marvels, right? And her code name most of the time is Photon. Um, but for a while, she does take over as Captain Marvel as well. So we're actually seeing Captain Marvel being handed down through several iterations of legacy characters. Goes from a white man to a white woman, from a white woman to a black woman, back again, and that mantle gets handed off quite a bit. This is Aqualad or Tempest there on the left, and with the advent of the cartoons, Young Justice, Batman the Animated Series, X-Men the Animated Series, and then the proliferation of the live action TV shows, especially through the CW, we get a lot of takes on characters. In fact, if you think back to Mr. Terrific, if you've seen all the way through Arrow, there is a version of Mr. Terrific who's like a double legacy character. So the original Mr. Terrific's a white guy, he becomes a black guy in the comics. When they iterate him to the TV show, he's a black gay man. And so we're adding levels to identity shifts. Um, Aqualad here, front and center, is just, a cousin or nephew or whatever to Aquaman. And then you extend that a little further to the Aqualad that takes place or that is introduced in the Young Justice cartoon, and that's an entirely different character um, named Calderon, who has taken the Aqualad uh, position after Garth here on the left retires and decides, he's doing more Atlantis stuff. That was an adaptation for the cartoon, as we will talk about Wally West Flash being black, an adaptation for the TV show that made its way back to comics. So here we have Jackson Hyde, who is basically the comic iteration of Calder. half Atlantean, the same way as uh, uh, Arthur Curry, Aquaman is. And we start this cross-pollination. This really gets kicked off with the Young Justice cartoon series. Don't remember what year that came out. Let's look up. So the Young Justice cartoon debuted September 9th, 2011. Um, oh, hold on. Nope, sorry. November 26th, 2010 was its first US debut. And then, yeah, so I was right with the timeline. We get Young Justice cartoon in 2010. We're not going to get the Flash TV series, which we'll talk about here in a second, until 2014. Also, kind of in conjunction with the idea that a lot of these heroes are moving on, this is Firestorm. Firestorm is in the constant state of having a nuclear reaction go off inside of him. He's actually two people. He's Martin Stein, who's like a crotchety old white professor, and Ronald Raymond, or Ronnie Raymond, there on the left, who's a white kid. This storyline for a number of years was used to tell generational gap stories because while it's Ronnie's body, Martin is a constant presence in Ronnie's head, and when they're in the Firestorm form and when they're not in Firestorm form, they're two separate people. Ronnie at some point has his biology changed and he can no longer fuse. Martin's going to explode and cause a nuclear explosion until he fuses with Jefferson there on the right. And now you have not just age gap, but age race gap to continue telling some of those stories, which is really interesting. I really like the new Firestorm. If you've seen Legends of Tomorrow, you've seen the character, but I would recommend folks read some of that if you want a really good look at how they tell age and race gap stories. It's really unique. This is the question. The character there on the left is Vic Sage. The character there on the right is Renee Montoya. If you've seen the Harley Quinn series, or the, not series, you should watch the Harley Quinn series on HBO. But if you saw the Birds of Prey featuring Harley Quinn movie, um, the Renee Montoya version of the question is who Rosie Perez plays. Um, both of these characters are basically like super detectives who are also conspiracy theorists. One of my favorite lines in all adult animation is from the question in the Justice League cartoon series, and he says the plastic bits on the end of your shoelaces are aglets. Their true purpose is sinister. And he creates a conspiracy theory around shoelaces. It's very funny. Maybe less funny now that we've had to kind of lean into conspiracy theory stuff with QAnon, but still funny. Um, Renee Montoya, by the way, you might recognize if you ever watched any of the Batman the Animated Series. She's a former GCPD cop. She has a drinking problem. She gets kicked off. Takes over for Vic when Vic dies. And then Renee is also a queer Latin woman and is in an on again, off again relationship with Batwoman. So kind of a neat extra layer there. Uh, this is Wildcat. Wildcat's really old. He's like 100 years old at this point, in the picture of him on the left, and yet his body's still in really great shape. His name is Theodore something. I can't remember Ted's last name, but he is a championship boxer, hence the ring. He's drawn there with the ring. He is who teaches Batman to box, is one of Batman's mentors when Bruce is a kid. And then the character that takes over him for a short stint in the Teen Titans comics is Yolanda Montez. Yolanda meets a really gruesome end in like the same run that introduce gives us like Bumblebee as a full member of the Teen Titans. So she's kind of an 80s character who doesn't stick around very often or very long. This is the Hulk. I'm sure everyone is familiar with him. I know we've gotten off in the weeds with the question and Wildcat, but we're back to some mainstream characters. There on the left is the Incredible Hulk. We all know Bruce turns into the Hulk when he gets angry. The character on the right is Amadeus Cho, and he is totally awesome Hulk, and he's able to turn into the power of Hulk with the power of self-confidence. Now, I like a lot of legacy characters. I think expanding representation is great. And one of my biggest things, especially about young heroes, is that they need to grow up, right? You can't have Dick Grayson be a 16-year-old for 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. At some point, they're like, okay, the people who were kids, in fact, most of the people who were kids in the 40s when Dick Grayson was, you know, born are dead now, right? 10 and 12-year-olds in 1940 are all 90 or older. And so one of the things that has to happen is your heroes need to grow up with you. They need to at least a little bit. And so that's one of the, I know we won't speak She Who Shall Not Be Named's uh, name and glorify her at all, but that's one of the things J.K. Rowling got right about Harry Potter is the kids grew up and they weren't eternally stuck in and they grew up alongside their reader base, and that's something that is tough to happen. And I really like when that happens. I really like when that does. But sometimes, sometimes comic creators and folks get so wrapped up in trying to give representation, they end up doing something really goofy like this and taking away from the original character. I don't love Amadeus Cho. He's fine, but the totally awesome Hulk as a concept, not great. This is Kid Flash, who I mentioned earlier, came from the CW show Flash. There on the left, that's Wally West. That's what he looked like originally, red-haired, green-eyed, kind of Midwestern nerd. On the right is Wally West from an alternate universe, young black kid. This concept started in the Flash TV series where they introduced, because Jesse Martin played Joe West, they introduced all of his kids as black folks, and Wally is kind of the youngest member of the Flash family there. And then they brought that concept from an Elseworld back into the comics. So it's kind of neat seeing all this cross-pollination. This is Valkyrie. Tessa Thompson did a great job as Valkyrie in Thor Ragnarok, and I'm hoping we'll get an opportunity to go back to her roots for some of that. She didn't really hasn't really been given a lot of screen time to do a whole lot since then. It's kind of mostly been cameos, and so I'm hoping that we get Valkyrie back. But Brunhild is the character's actual name, and Valkyrie is her position, and that's what Brunhild looked like there on the left. She's like a 6'6" Nordic actual Valkyrie. And so I thought Tessa Thompson's attitude and stuff, especially attitude and swagger for the character in Thor Ragnarok was perfect. This is an instance that hasn't made its way back to the comics and likely won't, um, just because Brunhild is kind of an established character, and also there's a cultural reason why Brunhild looks like that. Uh, I've got a couple more to talk about, and then we'll wrap up for the day. This is Nick Fury. When I mentioned the Ultimates universe came around, the same universe that gave us Miles Morales, um, when they were getting ready to come out, they were thinking about the MCU. There on the left, that's how Nick Fury is supposed to look in the comics. He's a white guy. He looks like David Hasselhoff. In fact, he looks like David Hasselhoff so much that David Hasselhoff played him in a made-for-TV movie, like in the 80s. It was terrible. Um, but there on the right is the Nick Fury that you all know because he looks like Samuel L. Jackson. And the reason he looks like Samuel L. Jackson is because the people who created Nick Fury for the Ultimates universe knew the MCU was getting started, and they actually were angling to have Samuel L. Jackson play Nick Fury already. And so they said, well, why don't we just make this version of him look like it? And then he can't say no, which I think is pretty genius. I love everything about that move, and obviously it worked. Um, yeah, I love that. Okay, this is gonna be our last legacy character we talk about today. And I mentioned before that sometimes you get goofy representation, and sometimes you get, um, gems, like obviously, and sometimes it's done with a purpose, like trying to convince Sam Jackson to play Nick Fury, which I love, right? He's the perfect person for that. And sometimes it's done in a way that's a miss. This is Domino. In the comics version there on the left, Zazie Beetz' version there on the right. And here's where I want to introduce a new concept to you. There's a question about this on your quiz, so pay attention. There is a concept among kind of minority folks, and it's called passing. So when we talk about passing, that's when someone who has a minority identity uh, can blend in with folks that don't. Um, when you add mutants, Domino's a mutant. She's a member of the X-Men or X-Factor, X-Force, one of them. But she's a sometime X-Men from the comics. But she is a mutant. And when you look at Domino on the left, the whole point of her character and one of the most powerful things about her storytelling is that she cannot pass. She is paper white, like printer paper white. She has a very dark, like ink black birthmark over her eye. She looks like an actual domino. There's nothing natural in her skin toning at all, and it's really easy to pick her out as, hey, you're a mutant, you're other, you're weird. We can set you aside. Zazie Beetz' characterization of her can totally pass as a normal person. She just looks like she has a birthmark. Maybe the birthmark is big or off colored to the point where you're like, oh, well, maybe that's not natural. But even her birthmark is done in a skin tone. Like if you were to zoom in on this picture or watch Domino, it looks like she's got lighter skin tone around her eye, where Domino is black and white. And I mean those in like the deepest, darkest of those colors. So most of the time, I have no issue with characters with legacy characters, being passed on or people of different races portraying a character. There's nothing inherently white about Superman. There's nothing inherently white about Wonder Woman, I mean, other than she's Greek, right? But there are dark-skinned Greeks, and there were certainly dark-skinned Romans. Uh, the problem here is that what we've done is we've taken a character that has a very dynamic, specific look, and we've turned them into a character who can pass, and we've taken away one of the most powerful things about the way their stories are told. There was some talk a while back about Idris Elba playing Batman, and maybe if they're not Bruce Wayne or their story's a little different, you could do that. But Bruce Wayne is a member of a colonial founding family. The Waynes came over before the United States was the United States, and they are old money in New Jersey. They're founding family of Gotham, and there's no way you could get away with a black person being descended from that family, right? Not realistically, not with this country's history of racism and slavery. And so you got to be careful when you're doing legacy characters, when you're handing off the representation, that they're done well and they're done with respect to both the original character and the source material and the stories they have to tell, and also how they're going to fit in the real world. And I think this is the one miss. So yeah, Domino isn't supposed to be able to pass, and Zazie Beetz' iteration can totally pass as normal. So that's going to wrap us up this week. Good luck, everybody. You've got your second writing assignment due this week on Civil War. If you have any questions, please email me, and I will see you next time.